And I love there's a Dilbert comic that was running like as the pandemic was ending, where the boss is like, you have to return to office to enjoy our unique culture. And he's like, all I do at the office is sit at my desk and wish to die. He's like, that's our culture.
Nice.
Hey there, welcome to Book Overflows, the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toops. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, it's good to see you, everyone. We are excited for the episode we have today. As always, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, especially if you're on YouTube. We do try to interact with the comments when we can. And it helps the podcast, helps promote us in the algorithm. We're seeing some good natural growth through YouTube these days, and we're really happy about that. But if you're listening to us on an audio platform, engage with the podcast how you can. The best way you can help the podcast grow, share it with a friend, share it with a coworker, share it with a fellow student. We really do believe in that. We're trying to make evergreen content here. And so we're always excited when people discover the podcast, because we think we have a good backlog of content for them. It's not like you can only listen to the most recent episodes. So I think if you discovered it early, think how much cooler it'd be to discover it later, because now there's like 40 great episodes you can listen to. And we have another great episode for you here today. We did this last week. We're doing it again this week. Like we say, we're committed to reading the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft, but we are also human and busy and have careers and wives and children. And sometimes we can't always read a book. And so when that happens, we like to take a smaller reading assignment on and instead read maybe one of the classic essays, or in this case, a manifesto. So last week we did the 12-factor app, and this week we're doing the manifesto to end all manifestos, the Agile Manifesto. If you live in software, if you work in software, you live in that sort of software engineering world, you are very familiar with the ideas of the Agile Manifesto. And I guess let's just give the introduction that they give. This all comes from, they actually have their own website, agilemanifesto.org. That's where we got all of this stuff. It's let's see, that the way they introduce it, they say on February 11th through 13th, 2001, at the Lodge Snowboard Ski Resort in the Wasatch Mountains of Utah, 17 people met to talk, ski, relax, and try to find common ground, and of course to eat. What emerged was the Agile Software Development Manifesto. Representatives from extreme programming, Scrum, DSCM, adaptive software development, Crystal, feature-driven development, pragmatic programming, and others sympathetic to the need for an alternative to documentation-driven heavyweight software development processes convened. And there are 17 authors to the Agile Manifesto. We'll give them all a quick shout out. That is Kent Beck, Mike Beadle, Ari Van Bennekom, Alistair Cockburn, Ward Cunningham, Martin Fowler, James Grenning, Jim Highsmith, Andrew Hunt, Ron Jeffries, John Kern, Brian Merrick, Robert C. Martin, Steve Meller, Ken Schwaber, Jeff Sutherland, and Dave Thomas. Now, you will recognize some of those names. Kent Beck, we read Tidy First by him, and we have also read and interviewed Martin Fowler and Robert C. Martin, more colloquially known as Uncle Bob. So some big names in the industry kind of came together to put together this manifesto. Nathan, it feels strange to ask you what your general thoughts on the manifesto are, just because, like we say, this is something that I think we've all heard about for a long time. It was my first time actually reading the full thing through. Was it your first time? And if it was, just give me your thoughts.
So I originally read the Agile Manifesto probably 10 years ago. The manifesto itself is very, very short. I think most of the juicier parts are in the 12 principles that we'll go over as well. But yeah, it's interesting. I think, like all revolutionaries, they're very good at critique and very, I would say, debatable on implementation of their utopian future. The same happened for communism. The same has happened for probably any ism that you've run into. Where I think that the Agile Manifesto, though, is like really important as a contrarian view on the way software was done before. And then, I think it's complicated and interesting. And I think this one's probably we'll probably get the spiciest comments that we've had so far. I think bring them on.
Please do.
I'd love to hear your experience of like how Agile has helped you, or horror stories. Like I want to hear both because I think it's really valuable to understand like what your experience was with Agile and probably a lot of times with Scrum, which is not technically Agile. There's actually no mention of Scrum other than some of the signatories are like from the Scrum world. But what I love about the Agile Manifesto, it's bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. It's got a very clear view of what they're trying to take on. It's a little bit anarchist in a way, and trying to like be anti-establishment, which I find really interesting because Agile is probably the most establishment hot take you could do in modern software development. So yeah, let's talk about it. This sounds fun. What's your view on this? Like, what's your initial thoughts?
Yeah, so I had never read the manifesto itself. I've read a million things about the manifesto. We'll get later into like who we would recommend this to, but I'll spoil mine off the top. I'd recommend that everyone read this because it's like a 15-minute read, if that, to kind of read. And we didn't just read the manifesto. We read, about the authors, about the manifesto. We read the Wikipedia article. We read, we're going to talk, Agile's Teenage Crisis is kind of a collection of criticisms about it. So it's like 15 minutes out of your life. And so I'd really recommend that you all check it out. Yeah, I think the Agile Manifesto has been completely a victim of its own success, right? This was absolutely a contrarian movement when it started. From what I understand about how software used to be developed, everything about Agile seems to be an improvement over it, right? From these massive waterfall projects. But I also, it's like you say, like, kind of comparing it again to communism, like true communism has never been tried, right? It's like people say true Agile has never been tried. There is some truth to that, but there's also truth to the idea that, like, well, if it hasn't been tried yet and it's been 20 years and everyone and their dog says that they use Agile, then maybe there is no such thing as true Agile.
Right.
I also liked that it was invented in Utah, my home state, in the Wasatch Mountains. It's about an hour drive from my house. And, it makes sense because every morning when I get up and I look at the Wasatch Mountains, something about them has always said to me, quality software processes.
Oh my gosh.
And so I'm happy to know where that comes from.
You just realized that it was individual interactions over process and tools. Just came right to your mind.
There's something about those mountains. And so I think, maybe the mountains inspired them. They would, they talked about coming up with the Agile Manifesto in Chicago, and who knows what it would have been if they'd come up with it in Chicago.
It'd have been the deep dish version of it.
Yeah. So we're gonna talk about it today. Last week for the 12-factor app, we kind of went through every single every single one of the factors of the 12 factors and discuss them in details. We're not going to really do that today. We're going to kind of give a high-level overview of the Agile Manifesto, chat about it, but we also want to devote a lot of our discussion today to criticism of the Agile Manifesto. And a lot of this criticism actually comes from the authors of the manifesto itself. So stick around for the whole thing. This is not just going to be an uncritical examination of Agile as a philosophy. We are going to get into all of it. And like Nathan said, we welcome your hot takes because we know, I don't think there's a single software engineer who doesn't have a hot take about Agile and its effect on the industry. So stick around. We'll be back with all that and more. And we are back. Thank you so much for tuning in. Well, let's start off just by reading the Agile Manifesto. It's like 40 words. So here it is for you, folks. We are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. That is, while there are values in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. That's it. That's the manifesto. There's 12 principles to the manifesto, which we're going to discuss in detail as we go along. But Nathan, any thoughts on just those that quick manifesto they gave right there?
Yeah. First of all, I'm very impressed that 17 people agreed that these were the words that were going to go there. I feel like that just getting a committee to agree to something is a challenge by itself.
The power of the Wasatch.
And also, I think this is correct in that, like, outside of, I mean, Agile becomes this really clear framework, but this really comes down to, trust your people, collaborate, work together, and build stuff that's evolutionary and can adapt over time, versus this sort of antithesis to the waterfall, right? And we talked about this in the Recoding America, right? That's actually a good example of where these agile methodologies work incredibly well for these like small projects. And I think that's probably one of the big things that comes away with this, is that like there's critique on this, on does it scale? And I would say that the agile argument in this purest form, and we're not talking about Scrum, and we're not talking about specifically extreme programming or any of these other things. Literally, can you get a small team to work quickly and have a narrowly scoped domain of problems that can ship output quickly so that you can iterate quickly, right? I think this is a good example too with like Multics versus UNIX, right? They weren't an agile shop, but they were at the same time. Like if you look at this and go, we just read Brian Kernighan's whole like memoir on how Unix was built, and it was literally this agile version of it, right? A very small team tried to solve a narrow problem and then iterated and iterated and iterated. And I think that there's no debate that part of the Agile Manifesto works.
Yeah, I think if you look at just this manifesto, right? I mean, what are we valuing? Individuals' interactions, working software, customer collaboration, responding to change. I think it's very hard to disagree with that in particular. I know in the Wikipedia article, the criticism section, it mentioned that university faculty in particular are really, in general, tend to be opposed to Agile because their work is not the kind that you can develop in kind of short spurts. Like I've got a buddy who's just finishing up his thesis, right? And his thesis has been like a 5-year endeavor. You can't ship every 2 weeks a working part of your thesis. So, I mean, obviously I kind of feel a lot of ways in Agile the same way I feel about like remote work. Like there's lots of debates about like remote work and does it work and things like that. And I always say I do not make any claims about remote work as a whole, as the future of working or anything like that. I can only speak to software engineering and my particular field. And in my particular field, I think we've proven that it can be done well. And so kind of similar with Agile, like I would not say that, like I know that there are like accountants who try to be Agile. I don't even know what that means, right? But as far as software, like, yeah, like I said, it's been a victim of its own success, and I'm too young to have developed in the olden days where it was big waterfall and you would have to spend, months gathering requirements and then you'd have to execute on them. But as you execute, you find out things change, and then how do you go back? I mean, it's like the unicorn project, right?
But at the same time, though, and I will say, I don't think it's appropriate for all types of software development. I think if you are working in a company that's trying to solve problems where the understanding of your customer, the understanding of your product changes over time, where I think it's inappropriate is actually the academic setting. And I think, our conversation with John Ousterhout is a good example of this, right? I would say he kind of represents a bit of critique of like TDD and a bunch of these other pieces. Where you run into this tactical tornado thing, right? This attempt to fight tech debt by being agile and reactive to changes can also create its own form of tech debt, right? Which is that you've architected the system poorly because you've optimized for the wrong thing. And if you're building software like the Raft consensus protocol or some new way of doing a replacement for TCP, low level, Linux kernel module territory, you probably don't need to do this in some like agile methodology. You probably need a complete design, think about it, let it kind of bake for a while, because once you've written that code, it'll probably stay somewhat unchanged for a long time.
Well, right. And that takes us, I think, into the 12 principles of the Agile Manifesto. 12 is, I guess, a good number for a manifesto. If we ever write one, Nathan, let's keep 12. That in mind. We need 12 of something. 12. Yeah. because the first principle that they have on their website, the principles behind the Agile Manifesto, they say we follow these principles. They say, so principle number 1, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. I think that's where the Agile process breaks down for people, is that idea of delivering valuable software. There's places where this works really, really well. At my work, I work for a large company, but I work in the growth organization. So even though I am not in charge of the software that kind of like generates all the money, I am in charge of making software that gets more people using our software that generates all the money, right? So pretty much everything I work on is like internal tooling, generally marketing tooling. So it's actually really strange because even though I'm at a large company, we function a lot more like a startup in this particular section of the organization, because like our products are only used by like a few hundred internal users, and then they're used to kind of again accelerate our growth. But compare this to when I worked at a large cloud provider. It was very different because we were working on a product that was the opposite side, right? Where we were working on a product that generated like $1 billion in revenue each year. And so before you did anything on that product, before you touched it at all, you want to be super, super sure that you were making the right decision. And so what am I getting at with this, right? In my current role, Agile, I think, works well because every 2 weeks or so, right, a sprint, we can ship valuable software. Like, for example, I'm tackling like, we kind of need to develop an ownership model for what we call them segments, but basically for some kind of like marketing tools, like who owns this particular marketing tool. We have a hard time determining who actually owns it. And so I'm in charge of kind of coming up with like the overall ownership strategy. One of the really cool things about tackling it from an Agile perspective is like in the old waterfall way, we'd spend a long, long time talking about what does it mean to own something? What exactly do we need to all, to straighten out, make sure we're all in agreement with. With an Agile philosophy, one of the things we're saying is like, hey, when this segment is broken, we want to be able to send an automated Slack message. And I'm like, I can do that this week, today. I can figure out how to do that. We'll get that done. We'll ship it. That gives us the valuable software. And then we'll keep iterating on it, right? And then if we need to come back and change it, we'll do that. So I appreciate that because that to me feels like kind of the heart of Agile, which is like, hey, I'm shipping useful software every 2 weeks. Compare that to the large cloud provider I worked at, where we would break up into sprints. But at the end of a sprint, even if you had your kind of assigned tasks, it's not really like you shipped super valuable software. Really, it would take about 6 weeks or so to actually get to something that was particularly valuable. But you have to break it up into 2-week tasks. And I don't know, it started to feel demoralizing.
Interesting. So do you do 2-week sprints at this current?
Yeah, we do 2-week sprints.
Do you
roughly? I mean,
do you also have like the formal Scrum Master sort of thing, or is it like a product owner that kind of helps?
No,
I'm always curious.
Yeah. So we used to, and that's actually something they talk about in the manifesto, which is like people over processes. We want teams to be self-organizing. My team is really big. It's 20 engineers, and wow. Yeah,
not a 2-pizza team.
Exactly, right. It's like a 4-pizza team. And we're spread out all over the world. And so roughly all the way. We have people in North and South America and Europe. And so we have to collaborate kind of on different time zones. So the team will often kind of get split into like different sub-projects, and then we will meet according to those sub-projects. And every sub-project kind of determines how often they meet. My 2 sub-projects each meet once a week. And we found that to be sufficient. We used to do like a daily scrum with everyone, and it was a nightmare. It was like 45 minutes and 20 people, and no one got anything out of it. So we did adjust.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I've seen this. This is the thing about Agile is that I feel like it's become such a fuzzy defined term that anytime I like join a new team, I'm always trying to like ask, well, what does Agile mean to you?
Yeah.
Because there's cultural norms around all this stuff, right? Yeah.
And Agile, I mean, it can absolutely be like, it is a powerful and dangerous tool in the hands of the wrong people, right? To organize all your work into 2-week sprints. Again, a lot of times when we estimate tasks in software engineering, like we're giving our best guesses. Like estimating software is still not a solved science. And there are people who take those estimates as the gospel truth. And if you don't finish on time, like there's hell to pay. And
Right.
especially the daily scrum, like I know I've described it, when I've done daily scrum to people who aren't in the industry, and like they're flabbergasted that every single day I have to report on what I did yesterday. And just that they view that as like a really, really tight monitoring of your work. And I'll say that I'm leaning, I don't know, like daily scrum is great when it's a non-judgmental environment, but yeah, like it can be anxiety inducing if you feel like you maybe didn't make as much progress as you would have liked the day before, but you have to come back and report on what you did. Like, yeah, I've been in stand-ups like that where it's not fun. It's not fun, folks.
So yeah, to wrap up that first principle, I do think it's an important idea, which is like, just ship stuff, right? Ship
Yeah.
stuff, break up your work in a way that you can have accountability and not just sit on your hands. Because I'll tell you, like I'm a recovering procrastinator, right? Like I think perfectionism can be this own little sort of curse.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I'll be like, oh yeah, it's just not quite right yet, and I'll like push it off and push it off. And really, what I'm doing is I'm just like scared about maybe the response, reaction people are going to have. And this kind of takes that, reduces the stakes and just says, look, what's some incremental unit that I can do? And I can still say whether it's ready for production or not, right? Okay, so the second principle, welcome changing requirements, even late in development. Agile process harnesses change for the customer's competitive advantage. Yeah, so
again, this is one of those things where it's like the fish, like this is just the water we swim in these days. Like welcome changing requirements even late in development. I'm like, yeah, that's all we freaking do. Like I feel like the requirements are continually changing, but again, didn't used to be that way.
Right, or it was like considered bad, right? I think it was there's like a Kent Beck story somewhere in here where some timelines changed or something changed because of the business, and his original estimate actually wasn't wrong, but he felt guilty. And I think that as long as there's a accountability cycle of saying, hey, this is why things slipped, or hey, we've decided to focus on this different area. Again, great piece of advice in general. I would say the counter argument to this is if you make it too easy to change the scope and requirements, you will get into this crazy scope creep cycle where you actually never ship the finished version of a product, right?
No, absolutely. And it can encourage you to not think, like sometimes you do need to think hard about what you're going to deliver. And if you kind of say, we'll just start building it, we'll figure it out later, right? Like it's great to be responsive and to change your requirements because they were genuine learnings through the process.
Right.
It's not great if you just kind of kick the can down the road and put the cart before the horse.
And I think that we talk about this in evolutionary architecture, right? Which is the last responsible moment, right?
Yeah,
Which is this idea of like, can I push some idea off? And this is a tactics thing that you have to really think about, which is when it really comes down to the word responsible. If you say, hey, we'll worry about security later, and you get the week before you're shipping something to production and you realize like with your security team that you've like made a fundamental mistake, you absolutely need to push that off, right? That is a completely justifiable thing. And you should push back against the person that says, no, figure out security after the release. And so, these are the kind of things where it's soft, it's squishy. And they actually talk about this in that a lot of these are squishy things. Like we live in a squishy world where not everything is black and white. We're constantly trying to define what things are. And so, yeah, it's interesting. Again, what I like about these 12 principles, and again, outside of a Scrum methodology or these other things, is these little things to think about, right? Give yourself permission to come up with the norms for your team to respond to a changing world. Which brings us to the next one. Deliver working software frequently, from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, with a preference for shorter time cycles.
I think we just talked about this, right? Yeah. Which is, it's cool. It is a really cool feeling to ship something that works and is in production within a week, right? Within 2 weeks. I really enjoy that. And we forget that prior to Agile, right? Like prior to CI/CD, this didn't really exist. You would write all of your software over the course of 6 months to a year and then have one big deployment. And you prayed and crossed your fingers that the deployment worked, right?
Yep.
But I also think, like, in some ways, like, this is right, like, the world has fallen victim to this. I mean, how many, like, video games these days, for example, are shipped that just kind of fundamentally don't work, are buggy? They can do that these days because they can put out a patch, right? Before, when your video game went out on a disc or a cartridge, it had to work. If there was a bug on it, it just stayed. It was there forever.
Yeah,
I do miss kind of like those quainter days, because like that was funny. Like there's some kind of famous video game bugs out there that, like, because they launch and you can't fix them. We don't really get that these days, or there's like a famous bug because if it's big enough to become famous, they just fix it.
Yeah, and there are some industries that do this, right? Like I would say the automotive industry, the Department of Defense, these places where the stakes are so high, you can't have a bug in your missile system, right?
Absolutely.
And you have to, and so like that's the thing, is like you're like, oh, we'll just figure it out later. We'll drain our tech debt or whatever. You're like, no, we're not. You can't do that. Like you actually need like provably correct algorithms and a bunch of other interesting frameworks.
Do you think like the CIA has like a PSYOP program where they send Agile consultants to like Russia and China to their departments of defense, and they're like, hey, it's okay, you can ship buggy missile software. You'll fix it later.
We'll fix it later. We'll have an over-the-air software update.
Yeah. So moving on, business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. I'm a big fan of this.
Yeah.
I really am a believer in the product-minded engineer. I think there are some engineers who say, well, I don't care about the business. I just want to focus on the technology. I don't think that philosophy makes any sense. I mean, the technology only exists because there's a business need.
The most dysfunctional teams I've ever been on had a very large disconnect between these two groups, right? And you have to be on the same page. Like the business folks need to understand how to speak developer enough to communicate, and the developers have to have accountability to say, how am I actually producing business value, right? Because I think it's really easy to either extreme. Business folks will kind of put timelines, point fingers, and make promises without actually talking to developers. We saw this in Unicorn Project, right? Where they would, we're shipping this thing next week. And you're like, you didn't talk to anybody about it. And same thing with developers. Developers can go off and, basically be like, Moses getting the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
And it comes down and they all break because business team has gone buck wild. And so you have to have that tight communication back and forth.
No, absolutely. And I also think it's, it's on the, this kind of plays into the next principle, right? Which is that, like, Agile, it's a cool framework and it's also dangerous in the hands of the wrong people. The next principle says, build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and support they need, and trust them to get the job done. That's a big underpinning here, because I do think that there are some engineers who don't like Agile because it introduces a higher degree of accountability. If you're in charge of delivering software over the course of a year, you can put it off for 4 months and then kind of go, balls to the wall for the last 8 months. You can't do that in Agile. But at the same time, I think there's some business folk who really like Agile because it lets them kind of twist the screws a little harder and say, hey, we got to, this thing has to get done in the next 2 weeks. Or you estimated that would take this long, but it's actually taking this long. What's going on here? But you got to have motivated individuals. And I think kind of in addition to motivated individuals, you have to have well-intentioned individuals, which, like, hey, I wish everyone was well-intentioned, but that's not always the case.
Right. Yeah. I mean, again, we see evidence of this is a good pattern, which is that, hey, if you hire the right team and you empower them to make real change in the system itself can't fight up against them all day, right? I think that's the other part, is that a lot of times you'll end up getting what I like to call scar tissue, right? The organization gets burned some point in its past, and they make a rule so that they can protect themselves from getting hurt. But that rule actually gets in the way of the fact that, like, you're now harming all of the autonomous and self-actualized software engineers that could actually be trusted. And so I think this is a good example of like always reviewing your processes, making sure that you're not bogging folks down the process so much that you can basically just take amazing talent and then disempower them to such a degree that they don't feel like they can get anything done anymore. And that's, I think, one of the things that they're trying to answer to here. And I think it was something I was reading about this was arguing that this was basically taking on like Dilbert cartoons or the comic strips, right? And so Dilbert, is ancient history at this point, but Dilbert was this, kind of like very cynical, sarcastic take on like modern 90s corporate office culture. And nothing got done, and there's so much bureaucracy and all this other stuff. And so like this was an attempt to take that on, right? To like do this counter revolution that's taking place inside of an organization.
Speaking of Dilbert, that kind of leads into the next principle slightly. It says the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. This is, I think this plays into remote work, and I love there's a Dilbert comic that was writing like as the pandemic was ending, where the boss is like, "You have to return to office to enjoy our unique culture." And he's like, "All I do at the office is sit at my desk and wish to die." He's like, "That's our culture." And so, I mean, I am, remote work, and maybe one day we'll have a whole podcast about remote work. Nathan and I both work remotely, and both are fans of the model. But talking face to face, and I will include video calls as to mean face to face. And in my opinion, you have to be face to face. I don't like taking video calls where I can't see the other person. I think it's important, right? Like, I think written documentation is way undervalued on software teams. And one thing I like about remote work is the heavy emphasis on written documentation. Like, I find that I'm able to unblock myself much easier in a remote environment because, I can scour Slack, or we've just been more diligent about updating our documentation. And so I really like that about a remote environment. But I also think that sometimes you just need to talk to someone face to face to clear something up. We actually use at my company, we have this really cool tool we pay for called Tuple, which is like super low latency screen sharing. It's designed for pair programming. And so it's just really easy to spin up a call. It's really easy to share your screen. It's really easy to control someone else's screen. And I really, really enjoy it. I like that the company pays for it. We're a completely remote company. And to me, it shows that they are invested in the sort of pair programming experience. But I know that some people really hate like, hey, let's hop on a quick call. And like, I get it. Sometimes that breaks up the flow. I always try to, if I need to get time with someone, to put like 30 minutes on their calendar, even if that's booking it like 2 hours out in advance. I'll usually Slack them and be like, hey, can we meet in 2 hours? But sometimes like, yeah, you really do just have to talk face to face or screen to screen to communicate important information.
Yeah. It's interesting. The company I'm working in now is predominantly open source, and the way that we do development is just different than inside of an organization. Some of it's just because all of our code's public facing. And so it is a lot more like what you would see other open source projects run, which is very document driven, right? There's a lot of independent work. There's a lot of folks, but at the same time, we do have this cadence of reviewing stuff together and being on video calls. Most of my video calls are those one-to-ones where I'm like, oh, I really need to talk to our security, the person who's like leading the security on this thing, or I need to talk to one of the core software engineers who has an understanding of the system better than I do. And that's way better than doing asynchronously over Slack or, some other chat tool.
I'm a big fan of Slack. I know some people hate Slack. I don't. I find it to be an accelerant to my productivity. But yeah, sometimes you just got to talk to someone face to face. And honestly, if you're a software engineer, like, get good at that, which is like a funny thing to say, but it's a skill that'll take you far.
It is funny. Our organization, Slack, is like internal business communication, except there's like a subset of us who don't use Slack at all. I use Slack. So then there's Signal, and we have Signal and Signal groups because there's some folks
Oh,
that are like
interesting.
super security oriented. And then we have like our public stuff, like anybody who's public uses Discord. And so I have like 3 chat tools that I kind of have to like hop between
Yeah,
depending on the context. So this is
that's funny.
definitely, but it's been fine. And again, there's no expectation of like immediate response type of stuff. It's mostly just kind of keeping track of the different communities that we have, which is again kind of interesting.
Well, and this is podcast lore for all of you, which is that Nathan and I have actually never met in person.
That's true.
Yeah, one day we will. We don't know when. And it's especially funny because you live in Colorado and I live in Utah. I'm like, I could drive to your house. Like,
that's true. That's true. Though I will tell you, out in the western part of the United States, and I think even most American citizens don't get this unless they've lived out in this part of the world. It's so spread out.
It's
like
so spread out.
It just takes like I think I've only been to Utah. Like I've been through the airport in Salt Lake City, but I've only been to Utah. My sister's a park ranger, and she works out in Moab, which is like pretty close to Colorado, like about one of the closer. So, but that's still like a 6-hour drive from where I am to get there. And so like if I was actually going to go to your neck of the woods, it's like probably
like
another
10 hours.
Yeah, exactly.
Something
and that's
like
just
that.
one state over.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm from Washington State originally, and my in-laws still live there. And so we drive to visit them, but it's like a 12-hour drive. But like from Utah to Washington, which again, if you're not familiar with U.S. geography, that's 2 states apart. It's Utah. You drive through Utah, then Idaho, then Washington. It is a 12-hour drive. And on that drive, like you drive through like the Utah Valley, which is like a lot of cities and suburbs. There's nothing for 5 hours. Then you pass through Boise in Idaho. And then there's nothing for another 7 hours. And then you are in Portland, the Portland, Vancouver, Washington metro area. Like, yeah, there is absolutely nothing out here.
I had a similar experience where like I had friends. I was living in Austin, Texas. My wife and I, is before we had our daughter. We were invited to a wedding in El Paso, and it was an 8.5-hour drive from Austin to El Paso, and you didn't leave the state because Texas is so large. And the further west you go, you really do. You have to like make sure you have like a full tank of gas because there might be a couple hours of that window where there's not even a gas station, right?
When we my first internship in school was in Orlando, and I did school out here in Utah, and I was a dad at a really young age. I had my first son junior year of college. And so my wife and we packed up pretty much everything we had and drove into our Toyota Corolla and put our son in there, and then drove for 5 days from Utah to Florida. And we took the long route. We didn't go the direct route. We drove down south to the border and then drove along the south because it was the winter. We didn't want to have to deal with snow. But like Texas, we did 2 full days of driving just in Texas. And like, there is nothing. It's crazy.
It's crazy.
I heard once that if we increased the population in the United States to 1 billion Americans, we'd have the population density of France. So like, just to give you folks an idea of like how much space there is out here, it's insane.
It is wild. Speaking of measuring things.
Yeah, I'm sure this is what you all tuned into the podcast for, a discussion of Western United States geography.
This is what chapter markers are for. So this will be fun. Working software is the primary measure of progress. So this is again, I think this is a good way of just saying like, you don't want to have something sitting for 6 months unworkable and then have a big reveal at the end. The idea is like, hey, like as a amendment to this idea of shipping things on a frequent basis, it should be working software, right? So like you don't just ship stuff and feature flag hide it and then just like let it sit there for 6 months. You need it to be something that that you're like, hey, I've expanded the feature set of this, and here's the measurable output over time. And again, I think for large teams that are building lots of little incremental components, this is a good way of thinking about stuff.
I think so. And like I said, it's really fulfilling to ship working software. That's something I tell people when they're interested in studying this field. I say, like, take CS 101 at your college and see if you enjoy that. Because if you enjoy that, there aren't really surprises after the fact. And obviously things get a lot harder. I know people who hit their data structures in algorithms class and then just think they made a terrible mistake. And I always have to tell them, like, no one's good at this stuff. But if you really do get that satisfaction of like, hey, I made a change in the code and it's reflected in the execution of the program, and like that really excites you, like that's the field. And so I think the more we can capture that feeling in our actual day-to-day work, that helps keep us going. And speaking of keeping us going, agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. I think that's important too, right? You can absolutely set up an agile cadence that will burn you out. But it's, if you, again, true agile has never been tried. But if you were to try true agile, you would want to be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely.
Yeah, I will say this is one of those where it's starting to feel like a consulting document.
Yeah, sure.
You know, where you're like, you know, you're basically making a business outcome claim. And I do think that you should be able to keep a cadence. Like, I think cadences are really helpful as a way to measure. Did you like? I found them like when I was CTO in early stage startup, I would care about this, like the number of points shipped per sprint cycle and things like this. Mainly not so that I could go and like ride people and be like, why did it dip 3% this week? But mostly be like, did I add a bureaucratic step that's actually slowing us down, right? Like I would do it more of like, have I cultivated an environment in which we can increase our velocity, or have I cultivated an environment in which new ideas can come into the pipeline and then we can ship them at some rate? And so it is a good litmus. That being said, if you had a new feature launch and then your bugs came up because you didn't have good testing in place, and customers keep finding stuff, and then all of a sudden your sprint points go down because 50% of the time of your engineering team is doing bug bashing, you know, your cadence will go down. It won't be a consistent pace, right? Like there's like a lot of externalities that can change. There's like a seasonality to this, right? If we talk about slow productivity, there might be some external events that came in that, you know, shifted this.
Absolutely. Moving on, continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. Again, this is very consultant-y, which is like, I think there is value to this. I have often said that there's much less of a trade-off than we think between good code and fast code. You can often write good code quickly. And that's what they're saying here, right? That like, you don't need to ship crap to move fast. In fact, often trying to do things the right way, technical excellence, will enhance your agility.
Yep. I will say one of the things that's really nice about this company I'm in now is we actually have like a very extensive testing suite. Probably one of the more sophisticated ones that I've used. Again, partially because this is out in the public, but also the way that we write software is really focused on provability. And I think when I've been in companies that do things internally, it's easy to skirt around the provability piece because you're just like, oh, well, the customer's happy, or nobody's complained, or these other things where you're like, no, is this the most efficient algorithm? Or like, you know, are we doing this in a way that if I load this up with the extreme use case possible on our server load, that we can prove that we won't, you know, degrade? And I think various organizations have various pieces to this, but to me, this pursuit of technical excellence is interesting. Again, it's a squishy term, and I think it both for the team, like the team itself should have technical excellence, but we should always be pushing ourselves, right? This is the point of Book Overflow: is can we improve our individual technical excellence? Like, and this could be anything from learning some idiomatic pattern in your programming language that, you know, maybe you're not, you know, you're like, oh, you know, we use callbacks, but like, am I using callbacks the right way? Or maybe, you know, there's some monad, you know, functional programming thing that you're wanting to dive into. You should spend time and do that. Like, let's say you've been wanting to get into Vim, and you just realize that you've seen somebody who looks like a coding wizard when they like really understand their tmux and Vim setup, or, you know, dive into some more advanced features with VS Code or something. You should do it, right? And you should do this because you want technical excellence and that you want to be the most valuable version of yourself. So I think this is like a head nodding, like, of course.
Yeah, I am a big believer I'm a big believer. I'm not always the best practitioner of the idea that like when you're lazy, when you cut corners, like the only person you're really robbing is yourself.
Right.
Like that's one of the great things about our career is that because it's knowledge work, all of this kind of technical excellence you build up, does it benefit the company? Absolutely. But it stays with you and it makes you more valuable. And it makes you, you can often command a higher salary or more flexibility or better perks if you are good at your job. And
Yep.
so, well, let's talk. We'll review the last two together just because they kind of relate to each other. The best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams and at regular intervals. The team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. I think this is where Agile really breaks down. Agile and Scrum, right, are often instituted from like the top down. And they get sold by some sort of consultant or a blog or whatever, and some engineering leader says, this is how it's going to be done. We have discovered the one true way to do Agile. Everyone needs to have stand-ups every day. Everyone needs to have weekly retrospectives. Everyone needs to measure their points like this, blah, blah, blah. But one of the key components to Agile is you got to self-organize. And as you self-organize, you got to take those breaks in regular interview or intervals to figure out if it's working and then to change your approach if it's not working.
Yeah. I know we'll get called out if we did this. We actually skipped simplicity. The art of
Did we?
maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. And
Okay.
the reason I bring this up is that actually I think all three of these go together. So simplicity one is interesting, right? Which gets back down to Yagni or you ain't gonna need it.
Yeah.
Which is that you should be able to say no. I mean, right? We saw this with Uncle Bob, right? This idea of saying, look, this isn't actually essential. And I saw this recently where one of our engineers was kind of getting hung up on this feature that the more he talked about it, you were like, wow, this is going to be really complex, and this is going to push this project out. And then our CEO is just like, we don't actually have to have this in V1. Like, you're right. We're going to hit these rough edges, but I think that we can do this and like have the simpler version and declare that we're not going to support these advanced features. And it was that permission of saying, look, this isn't a V1 feature that was really useful. And I think that took this from a high risk for more slippage into something that we could keep simple. And we are like obsessed with the simplicity piece, which again is refreshing.
It's nice. At my company, I've been sort of tasked with integrating some AI features into our product, just where it makes sense. For example, one of the things we do is the way kind of marketing criteria is defined is via a SQL definition, but obviously marketers can't really write, or via a SQL query, and obviously marketers can't really write SQL queries. Google provides this tool called Looker that will generate a SQL query for you kind of through like point and click mechanisms. But our tool requires a specific SQL syntax that the Google Looker SQL does not conform to. So I actually built a way where you could provide your Google Looker dashboard URL of the SQL you created, and then we parse it with AI because there's some very simple changes that need to be made to make it conform to our syntax. And we found that large language models were able to handle that pretty easily. And so that's really neat. And then I added, another little AI feature, but our approach to AI is still very experimental. And this could get into sort of like prime Yagni, where it's like one of the questions was like, okay, well, where are we storing the system prompts for our large language models? Because we want people to be able to or we want to be able to iterate on these prompts as we better understand what exactly we need from them. And so I was kind of like two schools of mind. I was like, okay, well, we could store them in like a Google Cloud Storage bucket, and then we'd have to set up a Google Cloud Storage client. And because we're working in Rust, Google doesn't offer one, so we'd have to figure out a third-party one, how to set that up. We have to kind of connect them together, but that would mean that product people would be able to kind of just swap out on the fly how to do that. And then my other thought was like, or we could just hard code it. And we actually have pretty good local development processes that it would take like 45 minutes to write up a document explaining to a non-technical person how to run the server. And how to edit the prompt in code and just test it. And also, because we're an internal tool, our deployment processes are pretty lightweight. It's like 20 minutes from merge to main to actual deployment into production. So if we want to update this prompt, it's not a big deal. That's the option we wound up going with, because we said, look, AI, it's still kind of experimental. We're not sure how much we want to use it. Even in the code I've written, I've commented in several places and been like, this is a naive approach. If we go further with AI, I'd like us to refactor this to look more like this. But for now, this is fine. And again, it kind of depends on the environment you're in, but I am becoming more and more a fan of, like, you don't have to see the end from the beginning. You don't have to create these wonderfully complicated architectures and features. Sometimes it's okay to say, we're doing this for now because we're not quite sure how important it's going to be to the project as a whole. If it becomes more important, we'll need to come back.
Exactly. Well, let's take a break. And then when we get back, we'll go over the criticisms and our personal experiences with some of this stuff, and then round up the podcast. So sounds great.
And we are back. Thank you so much for tuning in. Adding to Utah's role in the Agile lore, the Agile Manifesto authors actually reconvened in Snowbird, Utah, 10 years after the Agile Manifesto was created, and talked about what they called its teenage crisis. Yeah, it says the Agile movement is in some ways a bit like a teenager, very self-conscious, checking constantly its appearance in a mirror, accepting few criticisms, only interested in being with its peers, rejecting en bloc all wisdom from the past, just because it is from the past, adopting fads and new jargon, at times cocky and arrogant. I thought that was a good way to sum up Agile. I mean, this was 10 years after the fact. Agile is now a young adult, so I think a lot of these criticisms will apply, but I thought that was an interesting kind of way to summarize where Agile is at or was at.
Yeah, and this is interesting to me because, like, I'm trying to, like, go back in time. This was probably 2014 when I needed to understand the frameworks for managing our engineering team. I was, early stage startup CTO. I was the first technical hire at the startup, so I was employee number 3. And then I was actually built out a product and engineering team of about 9. It was 9 people total, and so we were constantly having to, like, think about and adapt our methodology. And so Scrum and Agile became like a thing that I had to think about a lot. And I remember somebody mentioned the Agile Manifesto, and that same exact website was up, and I thought, this looks ancient. Like, this is just a bunch of old dudes who wrote this thing, and this felt very corporate, like, especially early on. I was like, do we need all this formality? Do I need a Scrum Master? And do I need to do daily stand-ups and retrospectives and all this other stuff? And then I realized some of it was incredibly valuable. Like, I really like retrospective methodology. I really like this idea of the team itself critiquing the effectiveness of the things that we've done and making changes, right? But I will say, even then, back in 2014, which was a few years after this introspection, I felt a lot of the stuff that they were at least being self-aware. And really, this 10-year meeting is a retrospective on the Agile Manifesto itself. One of them was, and I think they bring this up, is that, like, commercial interests censoring failures, right? So this reminds me actually a lot of, like, the CrossFit community. In that early CrossFit, they used to have this theme that was like, they used to have a mascot which was called, like, Rabdo the Clown, and which is really horrible. Rabdo, I don't know if you know about this. Rabdo is this, like, you can die from Rabdo. If you do too many reps to failure, you can actually, like, rupture some stuff in your muscles, and it will actually, like, your urine will turn brown because of, like, dead cells and stuff, and you can actually die from, like, kidney failure and some other stuff from it. And of course they would, like, joke about it. And the thing is that, like, CrossFit in its longevity matured a lot. It had the same thing where it kind of self-censored the negative side effects of it, because people were like, oh, look how strong and fit you are and these other things. They would censor the sort of, like, dysfunctional pieces. And over time, the whole methodology adapted and got really effective. I think the same thing has come out of, like, Agile methodology. I think that the good parts have stuck around and evolved and adapted into forms that are really nice. And some of the stuff that's, like, I mean, it instantly kind of went into this, like, consulting practice. And so it felt like, you're like, oh, well, we want to do Agile. Oh, you got to get an Agile consultant. An Agile consultant has to come in and teach your Scrum Master how to be a Scrum Master, like, and buy the software that they also use. And you're like, okay, wait, this feels weird. Like, why do I have to have this whole like end-to-end software solution from one of the signatories of of the Agile Manifesto to do this work?
Yeah, it's a little like, go back to the 60s and you're a company that manufactures jet fuel and you're talking about the importance of putting a man on the moon, right? And like, you can really sincerely believe that putting a man on the moon will be a great accomplishment for the human race and an excellent feat for the country, and it'll boost morale and be great. You still manufacture jet fuel, or rocket fuel, I should say.
Okay, so I was like, jet fuel's not going to get you to the moon.
No, rocket fuel. But yeah, you manufacture rocket fuel, or you design spacesuits or whatever. You're like, oh, it's really important we put a man on the moon. It's like, that's true. You also personally stand to benefit a lot from us putting a man on the moon.
Right.
And I think the Agile authors have said that, kind of saying like, that's one of the criticisms here, is like pretending that it's not a commercial business. Like, it is. Agile has absolutely become a big business. And I think another criticism they lay out here, which is elitism, right? They kind of say, they say, as a defense against failure, we limit our message to the best and blame failure on the unenlightened others. True Agile has never been tried, right? If you did it and didn't work, it wasn't actually Agile. I've said this before on the podcast, but I'm a big believer in kind of the death of the author philosophy, right? I don't love when someone interprets a work one way, and assuming it's a valid interpretation of the work and their argument makes sense and all that. And then someone will kind of come out and say, well, the author didn't mean for it. What the author said it meant is this. Actually, I'm like, the author's not around anymore. The author put the work into the world, and we are allowed to interpret it as we please. I kind of feel the same way with that way about Agile, where it's like, well, the authors of the manifesto can say, no, that's not what we meant. That's not how you're supposed to do Agile. But it's like, enough people have misinterpreted it at this point, according to you, right?
Right.
That at some point is the core philosophy rotten, or at least too vague to be, I don't know, to not be interpreted poorly.
And this gets back to a core operating philosophy that I have, which is that revolutionary ideas in things like manifestos, like the Communist Manifesto is another good example of this, actually, which is, it's fantastic critique, but a terrible framework and game plan for the way the future should be built, right? So like, I know that it's a kind of a taboo subject, but like Karl Marx really did have some very good critique on like what modern capitalism was and what role workers should be versus, society. And if something's taken to its extreme, what bad outcomes would be there. I actually think anyone who's a fan of market systems or a fan of these other things, it would behoove them not to read Karl Marx, right? And the same thing with Agile. Even if you are anti-Agile, you need to be familiar with it, because there are some critiques of what can happen if you don't embrace agility, that you realize like, oh, here's the pitfalls of waterfall, right? Here's the pitfalls of never having feedback loops or these other things. And you don't have to do capital A Agile. You don't have to do capital A, registered trademark Agile, to understand that, like, yes, small teams are better than big teams, or empowering a small group of folks who are focused on a very specific problem can do a better job than a committee across 15 teams, right? Like, these are obvious things.
And we should mention that this is, we're getting this criticism from an article called Agile's Teenage Crisis. We'll make sure to link it. It's on infoq.com, published by Philippe Crutchin. So if it sounds like we're quoting from something, we are.
Oh, yes.
And so we'll make sure to link it in the episode description. One of the other critiques is abdicating responsibilities for product success to others. In particular, much of responsibility seems to be pushed to product owners, business analysts, users, etc. There's Agile can make you feel a bit like a cog in the machine. You just, the product owner comes up with the tickets, puts them in the sprint, and you execute on them. If it's the wrong thing that was built, that's the product owner's fault, right? I'm just the developer. I just build the system. you can imagine kind of in a more waterfall-ish world, or a world where developers kind of work more on their own, you can't abdicate that responsibility. You're in charge of the building the system from start to finish. I mean,
Right.
I think in most places, this again kind of comes down to, I think, just kind of like the quality of talent, which is that if you're hiring good engineers, they'll kind of naturally be invested in what they're building and take responsibility for it. And at a certain point, like, I don't know, I've talked to people, and I've seen some companies where like, why can't we get good talent? I'm like, because you pay 80% of local market rate, and I'm just talking local market rate, right?
Right.
Anyone who wants a remote job or is willing to pack up and move to Seattle or San Francisco can make triple what you're paying.
Right.
It's like that's why you can't hire good talent.
This reminds me of the this also reminds me of the meme where there's the guy who's like slowly putting on the clown
Oh
costume.
yeah.
And because like I think the Agile, capital A Agile, and these consultancies and corporate America, um, like Agile software development became corporate America software
Oh yeah.
development. Right. So it's like this was a resistance movement against these overly structured kind of crazy systems. And then these bigger companies do a version of Agile. They do like an Agile waterfall. Oh, I forgot. There's a term for it. SAFe. Have you heard of
Oh
SAFe?
yeah. I've heard of SAFe.
Yeah, so SAFe is like the thing. It's like Agile plus waterfall, and there's like people who are huge fans of it. But I'm just like, okay, this is like the natural evolution of stuff that happens, which is that you revert to the mean. You're like corporate America is going to do what corporate America does, which is like put a ton of processes on top of stuff in the name of protecting itself or doing these other things. And so I think it's important that the revolutionary spirit of Agile lives, even if it's not Agile anymore, right? You should create the little rebel alliance within your organization when you can. That's to me the spirit of where the manifesto came from. And you look at all this other stuff and you're like, you should give yourself permission to break the system down and ship stuff, right? Like if that's the idea. And I think Prime Eigen talks about this in on some of his stuff, is he's like very against Scrum and like, or in certain forms of it, but that like the core ideas of Agile are really strong. And I agree with that, actually. I think that that's a really cool way of looking at this whole influence on the industry.
I think that's about where I'm at too, to give parting thoughts, which is, I think the world is better. The world of software engineering is better because of the Agile Manifesto. I think it's an improvement on what came before it. And I think, if only because, like you said, Nathan, the spirit of the Agile Manifesto is build stuff, ship stuff, control your own destiny, be in charge of your workflow, and take pride in what you're building. Like that's the core of the Agile Manifesto. I think any philosophy that's kind of operating with that at the heart is going to probably do more good than harm. Again, I'm just simply not old enough to have lived in a pre-agile world, and so we'll have to see if we can get some of the signers on the podcast and
That would be
ask
cool.
them kind of to elucidate us with their wisdom. But it's but it absolutely, it's funny reading this 25 years later, because it's not revolutionary. This is like the rebels won. The rebels overthrew the empire and are in some ways the empire now.
Right.
And just it's funny just going back and reading the very beginning, reading the history, and again realizing that all ideas have a genesis. That was what was fun about reading UNIX: A History and a Memoir, is like, of course, UNIX is absolutely so commonplace in all development today, but it had to start somewhere. And similarly, Agile had to start somewhere. And so I appreciated this week taking the time to figure out where it came from, why it originated, what exactly the authors claim it to be, and just to reflect on how we're experiencing it today. It's good. It's good to know your history, I think.
Yep, I agree. So what will you do differently in your career as a result of this manifesto?
I know, isn't that funny? Just because I've kind of spent the whole episode talking about like, well, this is everything that we do. I like this idea of self-organizing, right? I think my team already does a pretty good job with that. But that's something I want to take with me in future careers and as I go to places. Is just either when I'm interviewing for jobs, trying to poke around and figure out, well, how self-organizing are you? Or if I wind up in a new company where I have a little more ability to influence culture, that's one of the things I'd really like to prioritize is let teams be self-organizing so we can adopt Agile as best as it suits our needs, because in the spirit of true Agile, that's exactly what you should be doing. You should be taking what works and leaving what doesn't.
Yeah, I love that too. I think that's the same thing. This is a reminder for me that this is really about empowering the little rebel alliance groups, right? Is that, am I imposing this structure on them because I'm the leader and I have to, and I'm in charge? Or is this the structure that teams adopted because they feel most productive? And I think that's a question we should always ask ourselves. That's a really good
Absolutely.
one. So
well, as far as who we would recommend this,
Yeah.
I said at the top, like literally to me, I'd say anyone. Just and not because I think it just in terms of effort to payoff ratio, like it'll take you 15 minutes to read all this stuff, right? Honestly, if you've listened to this whole podcast, you might not have to read it because we kind of covered it in depth. But this is so foundational to everything we live. It's kind of like if you're an American, it's like, who would you recommend the Declaration of Independence to? I'm like, it's not that long. Right? And like the Constitution is not that long. And it governs every single thing you do as an American. So you should probably at some point in your life take the time to read it. The Agile Manifesto is not the Constitution, but akin to the Declaration of Independence for the modern software world. Like it doesn't take you that long to read it. You might as well read it because it is foundational to every single thing you do in your work environment, most likely.
Yep, I agree. I would recommend. So I'm gonna take a little contrarian view. I don't recommend this to everyone, but I think that if you want an appreciation of the history of this, like it's so ubiquitous. Most of the books that we've recommended so far actually dive into this pretty deeply. But don't have a hot take opinion about Agile until you've read this stuff. Like, I think that maybe that's who I recommend it for. If you want to have a hot take opinion, go back and read the source material. It's always interesting to see where things started, and then how they actually were expressed in reality, right? I largely agree with all the criticism and hate towards formal Scrum methodology or feature factory, junk, or the fact that it's like busyness theater, all these other things where, if you just try to hit the Scrum metrics, you could actually make it look really good on paper, but actually just produce complete garbage. All of those are valid criticisms. And but I think if you look at the spirit of this, that's actually anti-Agile in that you should be empowering a team to think for themselves. And if you're just checking boxes and like making, the bean counters happy or looking at some analytics dashboard, you're not really solving business problems. You're not really producing value for the customer, right? So you really aren't meeting those 12 principles that were brought up in the first place.
Well, and something I found encouraging about reading this is maybe it's just because it was written in my good old home state of Utah. But there's a culture among software engineers, and particularly young, ambitious software engineers, which if you're listening to this podcast, you might fall into, that really prizes like the FANG experience. Like you got to work at Facebook or Netflix or Google or any sort of those FANG adjacent companies, right? Read the resumes of the 17 signers of the Agile Manifesto. Not a single one. And granted, this was 2001, right? So some companies like Netflix and Google don't even exist, and Amazon is still in its infancy. But no one from Microsoft, no one from Oracle, no one from Apple. A lot of these people were just consultants running their own businesses, working at places you might have never heard of.
Yeah, the only two that I saw, and they weren't listed in their actual author bios, but I looked, one of them had been at IBM, which was interesting because I think he was actually able to kind of see what he was comparing himself to. And then one of them was through academia, it was like related to MIT related research. but still,
But like Uncle Bob, we know, never went to college.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, I was the same thing. Like, I didn't think of myself, and we haven't really gotten into this. Maybe this will come up in some special episodes or something. But like, I was a theater major. It never crossed my mind that I would work for Fang. I haven't, because I just wasn't part of that stock. I was an non-traditional sort of background. I had kind of found my way into computer science and to software development. They're a pretty meandering, unconventional path. And so in some ways, the Agile stuff really speaks to me because this is a group of pragmatic folks who are trying to solve real problems in a very creative way. And I appreciate that, regardless of whether all of the outcomes were met that they wanted.
Absolutely. Well, it's a great piece of history. It's in some ways not history. It's our reality every day. So I'd encourage you to check it out, especially like Nathan said, if you're a computer science history buff, because obviously this is a huge influential piece of computer science. But I think that wraps up our discussion of the Agile Manifesto. We stick around for the next couple of weeks. We are going to ease up on reading. We're not even going to be reading essays for the next couple of weeks. Just Nathan and I are going to enjoy the holiday season, but we do still have some special episodes coming for you. They are all going to be Book Overflow related. Don't worry, they're not going to be a discussion of Western U.S. geography. We are going to we're going to play some do maybe some retrospective episodes, maybe play a game or two centered around the books we've read. We're really excited about these episodes. We hope you like them too. They might become a sort of end of the year tradition for the podcast, just to kind of reflect on what we've done and at the same time give Nathan and I a bit of a breather going into the new year. So please stick around. And as always, please contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io or hit us up on Twitter at bookoverflowpod. You can find me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. I'm not on there as much as I used to. But, if you message me, I'm sure I'll get around to you eventually. And you can find Nathan and all of his work with his Functionally Imperative newsletter, where he interviews fascinating creative folk at www.functionallyimperative.com. And if you want to keep up with the reading schedule, go to bookoverflow.io. We promise that we will read Sergei Oroz's of Software Engineer's Guidebook. That is our plan as soon as the new year starts. I had a dream I met him at a wedding last night, and I had to apologize to him for not finishing his book.
Oh, that's
really
funny.
Weird.
I've actually read half of it already.
Yeah, I know, right? I read a quarter of it.
But I need to I'll have to go back and probably reread /skim because I feel like a lot of things.
Because there'll be like a month in between. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. We really do appreciate you coming along for the ride. We like to save all of our kind of mushy thank you for supporting the podcast stuff at the end, because if you made it this far, you are a true fan. But we really just can't say how happy we are that the podcast so far has exceeded our wildest expectations. We are really so pleased at how many people are enjoying the content, and we hope to continue producing good content for you. Like I said, we try to produce evergreen content, and we just want to fulfill our mission of reading the best technical books in the world. And we hope that not only are you listening, but hopefully you're picking up whatever books are fascinating to you and becoming a better engineer by reading them. We appreciate you tuning in, folks.
And one last thing before we go, because I didn't say it earlier. Big shout out to Golang Weekly. We did not coordinate with them at all, but this is amazing. We were mentioned, our interview with Brian Kernighan on Unix history was mentioned in the most recent Golang Weekly issue. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but how cool. I just was
absolutely.
A friend shared it with me. I had actually not read my copy yet, and so awesome. So yeah, big shout out. Awesome. Thank you, Golang Weekly, and whoever submitted that.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Please spread the podcast far and wide. We're already very pleased at some of the cool stuff we've been able to give our listeners despite our relatively small size. And we are optimistic as we grow larger that we will be able to only do more and more cool things like that. So thank you so much for tuning in. We'll let you go now, and we'll see you next week for some of our special episodes.